All right, today I'm going to talk to you about Antifragile, one of my favorite books of all time. I'm currently reading it for the third time. This time I'm kind of taking notes, but today I wanted to go over some of my favorite concepts in this. One of the reasons why it's my favorite book is there are just so many patterns and mental models that are just so applicable. They're very vague and abstract, but I find that I just see them everywhere. Once you kind of learn about them, they are hard to unsee, and they're very widely applicable. So today this talk is going to be anti-fragile patterns. But first let's talk about fragility and anti-fragility, which is what this book is about. And basically it's talking about all of everything, all of the universe is somewhere on the scale. You have fragile, then you have robust, and then you have anti-fragile. And so I think it's easy to know what fragile is. It's basically the definition of an object that whenever something extreme happens, it doesn't like it. So a glass of water, if you drop it off of that balcony, it's not gonna like that. But if we kind of set it down, it'll probably never break. But then you have the robust. And the robust, let's say a steel ball, you can drop it off that balcony, but it's not might get a dent, but might get a scratch, but that extreme event isn't gonna hurt it. But a robust object is not the opposite of fragile, because even though that robust object isn't gonna be harmed from the fall off the balcony, it's also not gonna gain from that fall off the balcony. It's not gonna gain from that extreme event. So that's why Nassim Taleb invented the word anti-fragile, which is the opposite of fragile. Anti-fragile objects or people or organizations or nature, they benefit from extreme events, at least up to a point. So that's what we're gonna go over. We're gonna see, we all wanna be anti-fragile, or at the very least, we wanna be robust. We don't wanna be fragile. So this is kind of like a how to live life, but also how to strategize the organizations, how to build good businesses. And so let's get into it. The first mental model I'll just call reactive overcompensation. Now there's a lot of examples with this, and primarily in nature. But here we're going to use this beautiful picture of the Hydra. Yes, I did this myself. See the Hydra, Hercules, I believe, when he cut off the head, well, the myth goes to come back. And that's exactly the first strategy, the first mental model with anti-fragility. And this is one we see in nature a lot, where, and our bodies, let's say we lift 100 pounds, we lift a 100-pound bag. Well, our body is not only going to recover from that stress, that shock of trying to do a 1-rep max, but it's going to recover and build more muscle so that it'll overcompensate. So let's say you lifted 100 pounds this time, you're now going to be able to maybe lift 105 pounds next time. So this idea of allocating more resources than you think is necessary is kind of an anti-fragile strategy. And a big takeaway of what not to do, especially in engineering, is look at extreme events and consider those events to be the high water mark, as he puts it in the book. He argues that the Fukushima nuclear reactor incident was due to this very problem, this very mistake, not overcompensating, if we will, reactively. And so what happens is that engineers, they took the worst possible, I think it was a earthquake and tsunami incident, and they basically thought that tsunami is the worst possible case that can ever happen. And that's exactly what you don't want to do according to this principle. You want to consider, let's say you see a mountain as he describes it, you want to anticipate an even higher mountain being possible in the future. Or let's say a crash. Let's say you look at the worst crash in human history. You want to not say, that's the worst crash, that's what we prepare for. If we prepare for that worst crash, we're okay. What you want to do is say, I bet we'll see a crash that's even, let's say 50% more, 50% worse than that crash. So you kind of want to take the errors and the information that the world gives you and extrapolate even worse. And that's kind of the principle of this, having margin. And so that's the principle of, I call it reactive overcompensation, but also you can proactively add margin to your life. This is why we have a savings account, usually about 6 months for personal, but business, you should probably have about 6 months of expenses tucked away, no matter how well the market's doing. So moving on from this, the next mental model I'll call the mental model of creative destruction. And so this one is not quite an anti-fragile. You might not achieve anti-fragility like with the Hydra. The Hydra is gaining from the shocks, but with because it's getting 2 heads after it gets 1 cut off, it's getting better. This is a little bit more about at least being less fragile. And what this idea is, the concept is that the fragility or the anti-fragility of the collective, the individuals, is usually at odds and opposite to the anti-fragility or fragility of the whole, the society. So, for example, if we kill off a weak member, a fragile member of the individuals, one of the individuals, then the society as a whole is usually going to be anti-fragile, or at the very least less fragile than because of that. And so a really good example he gives in the book is, well, first, nature. There's usually an anti-fragile pattern in nature for everything. Nature is usually very quick to not only kill off fragile or weak individuals, but also kill off entire species. And so this is one of the main mechanisms which, like, nature's been around for how long? And so that's why it's sometimes the brutality of nature is what makes it so resistant to cataclysms, at least up to a point. Another really interesting business principle or example that he gives is the restaurant business. In the book, he talks about the fragility of the entrepreneur and how that benefits the society as a whole with the restaurant business. So we eat pretty good food here in Nashville, but that's due to how hard and how error prone it is to start a restaurant. I'm sure you've heard the advice is, whatever you're gonna do not start a restaurant, because I feel like everyone goes out of business. But it's that very fragility, that proclivity for restaurants to go bust, for the individual to die, that makes the society as a whole at the very least robust or even anti-fragile. And so if you can actually switch that though. So if the individuals become anti-fragile, then that oftentimes fragilizes if that's a word, fragilizes the collective. So an example of this is just, well, our current economy. We have a lot of anti-fragile entities, whether it's too big to fail financial organizations, or let's say, help me out, what's something that, I feel like, what's the last thing that got bailed out? I can't think of one, but we have a lot of things that get bailed out and can't fail. And because of that, we have become more fragile because of that. So the takeaway is just, if you want the collective to be anti-fragile, you need to not be afraid of the fragility of the individuals. The next mental model has to do with volatility. In modernity, Nassim claims that we are really afraid of volatility. We have the Sharpe ratio for a reason. Investors not only want to see managers who have good returns, but they also want to see consistent returns. So a manager, believe it or not, would rather have, many investors would rather have, let's say, a smooth 20% than a crazy volatile 50% gains a year, which to me is insane, but people really like that smoothness. But Nassim argues that's a way to fragility. And he argues this is because one of the reasons why an absence of volatility is possibly a warning sign, is because in modernity, that stability, that lack of volatility is usually artificial. For example, if you're having steady returns, he argues an employee is more fragile than, let's say, a taxi cab driver, or I think he even mentions a prostitute is a little bit more or less fragile than an employee. Let's say they both make 10K a year. They're really good at what they do. The employee is just going to have a steady 10K or $100,000 a year. The problem with that, he's not getting much market feedback. So whenever a shock happens, whenever something bad happens, it's probably because he got laid off. And so that's probably, if he hasn't been in tune with the market and he hasn't looked for a job in years or decades, then that's pretty bad. Whereas if our taxi driver or our other unscrupulous professional gets feedback, if they have a bad week, then the taxi cab driver can, let's say, go to a different street, different part of town, and the aforementioned unscrupulous individual can maybe perhaps find a new street corner to let's say try something new. So volatility is oftentimes a good feedback. It's the general sense is that whenever you suppress that volatility, it just builds up. And he also argues that one of the reasons why we have such brutal wars, the world wars, or we have such brutal pandemics, or because we really suppress those small outbreaks. He argues that small wars once in a while would save millions of lives. And because if you look at the world wars, he claims, I don't know much about the lead up, but we seem to have more peace. But whenever that peace breaks, it's really, really bad. It's exponentially bad. So that's kind of, you always want to be a little suspicious of stable things, and you want to train your brain to not be afraid of volatility. And not only do you not want to be afraid of volatility, but sometimes you want to inject volatility artificially, especially in engineering. Sort of, there's a lot of, or even political. He talks about political annealing, where people have had success randomly inserting randomly selected individuals into Congress as like a subpopulation of the legislative body. And he also talks about simulated annealing, and this is really cool for me because as a software engineer, I've used simulated annealing with great success in the industry, coming up with optimization problems that otherwise wouldn't have been able to happen because the injection of randomness actually kind of shakes loose a process, to use non-technical terms, and comes up with a better solution due to that randomness. So usually don't fear volatility, fear stability. And all right, so that's, I'm going to call that principle volatility tolerance, or even volatility injection. Now this next concept is called the option. This is really the brunt of the book. He talks a lot about optionality and how to exploit it and how to see it. And so this is probably the biggest part. The more options you have oftentimes correlate with how anti-fragile you are. But first, let's actually talk about what an option is. So he uses the financial concept, the financial instrument, the financial product as an analogy for life in general. So if you're unfamiliar with trading, an option is basically a product that you can buy. I'm specifically referring to an out of the money call, where you usually pay for this option. Let's say it expires in a month. So you pay for an option, it lasts a month, and let's say you pay $100 for it. So this option that we buy is going to last a month, and at any point in time, if the underlying security, let's say it's the stock, let's say it's Google, if that goes above the strike price, then whenever you sell it or you, I forget what it's called, you activate it, I can't remember the term, but you get a gain, you get a theoretically infinite upside proportional to how much it's raised above that strike price. So the idea behind the option, and what's really important, is that it's high risk, high reward, but the gain far outweighs the cost. And so Nassim Taleb, he's a trader. He used to be an options trader. That's kind of how he cut his teeth on the whole risk expert business. But he says that he claims the more interesting options are the options that life gives us, what people give us. And so he argues that options are usually, for the most part, excluding fat tails, options are usually well priced. So, but oftentimes he argues that the options that life gives you are oftentimes cheap or even free. So an option in real life is just something you have the right to do, but you don't have the obligation to do it. So the main, he starts out giving this example where you're a tenant at a rent-controlled apartment, let's say in New York, and as a tenant, you get the option, you get the right to leave at any time, but you're not obligated to leave at any time. So let's say inflation is just kicking up and you can stay there indefinitely. Let's say you got $1,000 a month. You're probably not going to find that anywhere in New York anymore. I'm just picking a price, but you can stay there at $1,000 as long as you want, but you have the option to leave at any time. So that's a free option. So let's say we have the biggest New York City market real estate crash we've ever seen, and he now has the option to leave when it's best and maybe pick something else up for a good price, or maybe even get a better rent controlled price. So this is the concept of the option, and life gives us these, but I'm gonna go over a few ways that you can best exploit and see options in real life when they give it to you. So the first one is just trial and error. You know, in the business world, they talk about decision velocity. What you want to do in life is just get feedback. And this is why it's really important, Nassim argues, is to live in a city and to talk to as many people as you can. I heard someone say that social fear is a vestigial emotion. What's really interesting about that is social fear isn't really useful anymore. I think Naval said that, where I'm afraid of talking to new people, but that's not really useful anymore because we're no longer, our life and death isn't tied to what our clan, what our tribe thinks of us. If you make a fool of yourself one place, you just find new friends, shrug it off. So that's a big point in the business world is you want to, meeting people and talking to people is a very optionality laden activity because the downside is very low. It seems scary and it seems like meeting new people or approaching people is bad news, but it's virtually cheap. You might get laughed at, you might get rejected, but that in the long run is very low. But then you might meet someone that changes your life, and that relationships are basically everything in life. So that upside. So you should really, as a business person or just anyone, you should engage the optionality. You should meet people, and if you're running a business, you should have a high decision velocity where you're getting feedback as soon as possible. You're doing a startup, doing tech, you want to launch really quickly, you want to fail fast. That's also something that they say, and you just want to keep churning. You want the optionality, you want the information that the market gives you and life in general gives you, and because the upside is usually tremendous, but the downside to failing is very rarely life or death. So that's the first thing, is consider trial and error. You want to fail as much as possible because usually those failures are they're very little. And then what was that second point besides trial and error? Anyways, we're gonna go to the barbell strategy. I might remember it. The barbell strategy is really interesting because, I remembered. The barbell strategy is really interesting, and this is a really interesting pattern that I see all around life. It's like I see it everywhere. It's really beautiful. The idea why the barbell strategy is useful is because the human brain is usually really bad at evaluating things, at least Nassim claims, evaluating things whenever they're in the middle of any sort of spectrum. So he first starts out talking about the spectrum of low risk to high risk. So he says you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket into a medium risk asset, let's say the S&P, because if we think something is low risk, or medium risk, we're really bad at actually evaluating it. What we're really good at, or better at, is evaluating if something is low risk or evaluating if something is high risk. And the risk spectrum isn't the only thing. I think like quality is another one that I see in products. I see people make the mistake of going for medium quality stuff, and I don't think it's kind of hard to find medium quality. I say get cheap and bad quality, or really expensive, really good quality. That's another place in life I see people make this mistake. But the barbell strategy comes in because this barbell strategy talks about a bimodal strategy instead of the model modal. So in the S&P, in trading or investing, instead of putting all your portfolio in the S&P or related securities where it's just medium risk, we have like a life-changing crash like every decade. So is the S&P really putting it all into one basket really medium risk? You might argue it's high risk. Anyways, rather than doing that, you want to put most of your eggs, you want to allocate most of your portfolio into a low risk, low return, and then you want to do a little bit into, let's say, high risk, high reward. So that bimodal strategy is oftentimes way more robust than or at least less fragile than the medium risk, because oftentimes that medium risk or medium quality is actually you just put all your eggs into a pretty high risk asset or a low quality asset. So for example, if you put all your money into an example of a high risk, high reward, would actually be an out of the money option. You could put most of your money into, like, let's say treasury bills. I'm not sure if treasury bills are low risk anymore in our current political economic climate, but let's just say they are. Put most of your money into T-bills. This isn't financial advice, I'm just conceptualizing. And then let's say, allocate a couple percentages of your portfolio into high risk, high reward leap options that would change your life. The idea is, if they happen, if they do well, then they do well. But then if you lose all your money in the high risk stuff, then the low risk stuff, in theory, will just kind of balance that out. So, and I just remembered the last point on how to sort of leverage options is, he describes living life in a non-teleological manner. And what that means is, teleologically means if I'm living life in a teleological manner, then I'm doing tasks in a manner that I'm very rigidly, narrowly focused on the outcome, and a specific outcome at that. And for example, let's say you go into a job interview and you're going to be like, I have to get this job, but you might meet your future spouse at the job interview. You might meet a new business partner. You might just have a really great lunch and find a new place to eat out. There's just so many options that you cut off from life whenever you are just rigidly focused on getting one outcome. So that's being non-teleologically, to a point. You don't want to be like unambitious, but oftentimes in life you want to be, I would say, you want to have goals that are strong convictions, but loosely held. So you want to go hard after things, but also be open to the free options that life gives you. Because if you're narrowly focused, then you close yourself to all the free options, the free good things that life would have given you. So like I said, trial and error, rapid trial and error, the barbell strategy, to couple low risk with high-risk options is another way to utilize optionality, and then being non-teleological, there we go, is the last kind of way to leverage options. And I think we're going to our last, and one of my favorite concepts in how to leverage antifragility, and that is what Nassim Taleb calls the Lindy effect. I don't remember why exactly he called it. It has to do with, don't ask me. But basically what this means, it's a way of, this is important because it's a way of detecting, not necessarily becoming antifragile, but detecting antifragile concepts and choosing those over the more fragile concepts. And the crux of this, there's a few key points. One is that whenever you're evaluating whether something's fragile or antifragile, it's important to correlate randomness with time. So the more time you have, usually it's the more randomness, the more shocks, the more black swans that will hit a system. And so the reason why the test of time is so important is because if something is still alive after a longer period of time, it's more likely that they're antifragile, or at the very least less fragile than something that has survived for fewer years. And so that's the first point. What makes Lindy effects good? Time equals fragility in this equation. But then the second point is that living things and non-living things have different relationships to time. So let's say organic things, people, dogs, even more tragically kittens. The older a cute little kitten gets, the fewer predicted remaining years it has. So a cat that's 10 years old is on average going to be, it's going to die earlier than a cat that's 5 years old. But the exact opposite thing happens with non-living things. We have a book, or we have a technology or a concept or some sort of intellectual property, or even like a fashion style. These things don't relate to time the way non-living things do. So let's say you have an idea or a business strategy or some sort of intellectual, abstract, non-living thing that's effectively immortal. The longer it ages, the longer it remains relevant, the longer you can predict it to be alive in the future. So let's say a book that is still relevant after 100 years is going to be not only longer than most likely going to be alive and relevant much longer than a book that is 10 years old, but oftentimes I think he makes this heuristic where you just take the previous lifespan and you apply it to the remaining lifespan. So like, was that Hero by Lawrence of Arabia? That's probably a very old book, I think. So you can, let's say I'm betraying my lack of history knowledge. Let's say that book is 100 years old. He says that you can predict on average that book is going to remain relevant for 100 more years as just a rough heuristic. And so here, sadly, the book will get better, but the puppy dog will probably be no more in 100 years. And so for me in technology, I think this is a really powerful concept because we are subject to what Nassim calls neomania, where we just want the new thing. We look at non-living things and we like, that's 10 or 15 years old. It's probably time for a new technology to replace that, or it's probably a time for a new book to be published talking about the same thing with just a new flashier cover and a lower reading comprehension level. But you should do the exact opposite. To be anti-fragile, you should try to accumulate things that have been around for longer, push the boundaries on the age, but then as long as they're still relevant, those things are likely going to be, those technologies and ideas are likely going to be, at the very least, less fragile than their contemporary, newly invented counterparts. So yeah, just to sum up, we got these 5 mental models. We got the reactive overcompensation with the Hydra, the creative destruction fragilizing the individual for the benefit of the society or collective as a whole. Then we have just don't be afraid and perhaps even seek out volatility. Then we have options, the barbell strategy, living life non-teleologically, and trial and error, rapid trial and error. And then, of course, the Lindy effect. Seek out old things when they're in the realm of the non-living, non-perishable. All right, thanks guys for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this book, but I highly recommend you read it because, like I said, this is my third time reading it, and it probably will not be my last. So, thanks for listening.